welcome to another episode of the Divine Council Worldview Podcast. Thank you for joining us, and welcome, Mike. How have you been doing?
I've been good, Ron. It's been a couple of weeks since we were able to see each other, so it's good to be back.
Yeah, what'd you get for Christmas? Anything academically stimulating?
I've gotten the chance to read a couple of books, thankfully, that were outside of what my my doctorate is focused on. So that's been pretty fun.
So you're in school, so you always have that issue to play with.
I always do, but got a chance.
Joyfully outside of that, but
got a chance to read like an early copy release of Matt Halstead's "The End of the World as You Know It."
Oh, good. I'm interested in that. I'm talking with Matt almost daily on another issue, so.
Yeah,
we look forward to talking with him, in fact, on this podcast in an upcoming episode. That'd be fun.
Yeah, that would be fun. Matt's a great guy. So,
yeah. And we just came to the 11-month anniversary of Mike Kaiser's death. And so, and I know that was a hard time for your family as well, right? Your sister passed away.
Yeah, my sister.
Same day?
Yeah, she died on the same day. Her name was Ruth.
Wow.
She was my older sister, and we had gotten the call from the hospice because she had, unfortunately, complications from breast cancer that existed for about 5 years. And eventually she had to be submitted into hospice. And so the nurse called us that morning. I think that day was also President's Day. And so pretty much all of my family on my father's side, most of them are here, and so they were all able to come to say goodbye to her on that day. The nurse told us that she probably would make it probably through the night, maybe for a few more days. And so I went back home after the family left to pack up some bags. Me and my wife, we were going to stay over at the hospice location. And just as I was, finishing up packing, I get a text message from Drina that Mike had passed away.
Wow.
And
amazing.
It was really, really surreal. And then a few minutes later, I get a call from my wife asking if I was almost done. And I said, yes, I was about ready to leave. And she told me, get here as soon as you can. And when I got there, it turns out my sister's breathing was becoming more and more shallow, more and more difficult. And so we were able to spend essentially the last minutes that she was still here with us, there with her. And so, at least I had that blessing to be able to say goodbye to her properly and to be there. But it was really surreal that both Mike and Ruth essentially passed away on the same day. And then a few days later, I realized they met each other at the council.
There you go.
And just had this kind of amusing idea in my mind that they might be sharing stories about who they had left behind, who were their loved ones, and I could just imagine that they would stumble upon it's like, wait, what was your last name?
Yeah, right.
It's
right,
Chu.
Right.
It's like Chu. You don't happen to know a guy named Mike? And just imagine the hilarity of just how that kind of coincidence would happen. But
I've often wondered about the afterlife, and of course, none of us know until we get there. But the idea of having fellowship with others besides the Lord, and how will we meet other people? And will we have to get a ticket or a reservation to have lunch with C.S. Lewis? Those kind of questions always are on my mind. And who knows? It'll be better than we can imagine. So we have to leave it there. But thank you for sharing that. I know it's quite an amazing thing to lose both a great friend and a family member in the same day. So our thoughts and prayers go with you.
Thank you.
Well, we are going to head into Genesis chapter 2. Now, our last time together, we ended 1, and we did talk about the end of 1. In fact, let me share my screen with the biblical text in front of us so we can work through that as we need to. Let's back up. The whole discussion of Genesis is coming into the Divine Council Worldview podcast because, number one, Mike never got there, and I'm sure he would have, and it's obviously the formative book of the canon, and for any discussion of divine council issues, which we want this podcast to foment that, right? And we would need to eventually get to Genesis because it's such a formative book. So this is that, or that is why we're jumping into Genesis as a new podcast, because it's just a great place to start. So we should also say that there's a lot of ways to study Genesis, and it's not our intent to be totally comprehensive or exhaustive. So we have to be selective. So with the purpose of this podcast, we're going to be attacking the book or studying the book from a Divine Council Worldview standpoint, picking out those points that would be interesting or even necessary to a Divine Council Worldview. And we had talked, such as in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God, and we had to take a little bit of time, and we did, with the word Elohim. You can see it on the screen that when I hover over the word God, at the bottom of the screen is the Hebrew word Elohim. And we talked about it, that the challenge of the word is that it's not capitalized in the Hebrew Bible. There are no capital letters. So you're just coming upon this word, shall we say, just the stark nakedness of this word, this title, Elohim, which can be used in various ways. And we capitalize, notice on the left is the ESV, in the middle is the New King James. They both capitalize the word God here. But when when that word is used in a sense that does not refer to Yahweh, our Bibles will not capitalize the G. And so just be prepared as we discuss the Divine Council Worldview issues that are within the Bible. The word Elohim is going to be a very constant issue in front of us, and it does not mean, here's the point, it does not mean God. The English word God is just too, it's too recent. It's too anachronistic to take that English word God and put it back into the Old Testament text, because they didn't have that word yet. They had Elohim. So let's skip up to the end of chapter 1. And my point as we ended 1 is that, well, as you see in yellow, there are numerous times, in fact, it's 10 times that we have in verses 120. I think it started earlier than this, back in 111, 112 twice. You have this phrase, according to their kinds. God is creating plants and animals, and then they reproduce, quote, according to their kinds. It's twice in 121, twice in 124, 2 more times in 25. That makes a total of 10 times that God is creating the world and putting it in a motion that will reproduce itself according, quote, to its own kind. And my point that as we came to 126, then God said, and that said is singular, so we know we're talking about the Jewish or the Hebrew God here, Elohim. So capital G is fine. God said, let us make man, there's the word Adam in Hebrew, let us make, so that could be mankind, and my notes, in fact, even mention that in the ESV. You could say, let us make mankind. The word Adam, again, will be a later word that we'll notice. But let us make man in our image. And notice the our. That I was just studying, Mike, this issue, of course, getting ready for this, and just looking through some old theology books, and the very titles of chapters, made in God's image. We are in God's image. I think often forgets that the initial statement is a plural idea. Let us make man in our image. Notice, by the way, the New King James, this is what reminds us that all translations are interpretations. Notice in 126 of the New King James, let us, and they capitalize. This is the New King James. They capitalize the us, and they capitalize the our, because they're suspecting, and again, this is one of the rules of Divine Council Worldview thinking. You don't want to think too quickly, right? You want to think like the original reader and writer. But the New King James is saying, well, this is probably, in fact, we're going to make the call, this is the Trinity. Let us make man in our, and the our is capitalized out of respect for the Trinitarian idea of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Notice in the ESV, they leave it with the our being not capitalized. At least that gives the interpreter reading this text the right to go either way. But I think your opinion would be my opinion on this, that the our here is God talking to an entourage of some kind. It's not named, obviously. But that entourage in the ancient world would be the greater the king, the greater his court. That's just how they thought. And so God, speaking as the supreme king of the universe, as it were, in his courtroom, in his throne room, he would be surrounded by a host, a court, an entourage. Those words, by the way, are synonymous in Hebrew, or in fact, it comes out of the same word. So when we talk about divine counsel, I think it's fair to say for all listeners, that may divide out on different interpretations within our discussion. When we talk about divine counsel, we could also just say divine host, because it's the same word, same idea. And to say that a council, in other words, in English, the word council has kind of a connotation of sitting around a big, round table and
the fellowship
discussions about what should we do. And I realize that feeling of a council meeting can be a bit Englishized, very modern compared to what the Old Testament probably is trying to pass along. So even when you said that your sister Ruth and Mike met in the council, my mind spins, of course, and I'm thinking, well, the host would be fine too, right? In other words, however God is organizing his host in the heavens, maybe the word council can be a little bit maybe too specific in how, the connotations that it brings to the English language. But that's the point here in 126. And I just wanted to, run that by us again as we get into this, that what God is doing here is he's stopping the conversation about making animals and plants according to their kind. Mm-hmm. And then he has this, I think it would have been a shock value to the original reader or hearer, let us make Adam, or mankind, whatever that is, in not their own image, or not according to some other animal that I've made before, but our image, meaning let's make him more like divine beings than animals. And then that second phrase, after our likeness, image and likeness again, run together in this verse. They do in 5:3 as well. They switch the order, likeness and image. So let me just mention, and you had sent to me notice of a book. Give me the name again. It's a Catherine McDowell.
Catherine McDowell. She was one of my Hebrew professors at Gordon Conwell. She wrote a book.
And the name of the book?
The name of the book is named "The Image of God in the Garden of Eden," and I think the subtitle is "The Creation of Humankind in Genesis 2:5 to Genesis 3:24." In light of the mission.
This is her
It was her. I believe it was her dissertation.
Yeah, that's how it reads. And thank you for sending that over. And I enjoyed it a lot to move through it. And on page 130 or 120, somewhere in there, here is a quote from that book that she wrote. Clearly, about 3-4 lines down, clearly the author is emphasizing when it comes to made in the image of God, image of Elohim, our image. The author is emphasizing the creation and reproduction of each species according to its own distinctive type or class. That's previous to 126, right? Mm-hmm. Thus, the ancient audience may have been surprised when they heard or read the next two verses, 126 and 7, in which the creation of humans is described not, there's the shock value. They were expecting to get that line again, but they don't. It's described not as according to his kind, as they might have expected, but as in the image of and according to the likeness of. Now, she capitalizes Elohim there. I understand why. You could leave that capital E off. If I was her dissertation advisor, I would have recommended it, because remember, in the text, it's our image, mm-hmm. not mine, but our image. So I think it's the in the image and according to the likeness of plural Elohim. This juxtaposition of the oft repeated according to its or their kind with the image, or in the image and likeness of Elohim, suggests that the author was drawing a sharp distinction between humans, there it is, and other created beings, meaning animals and even plants. However, it also implies that just as, let me go to the next page, actually, this is a whole different quote. So we can leave it there, but I wanted to pick up another thing she said here, right at the top. Thus, it seems that being created in the image and likeness of God is both comparable to being created according to God's kind, but is distinct from it. In other words, humans are not divine, right? We are a hairless biped that looks a lot like the animals around us in that story. Nor are they members of the heavenly host. Good point. They are their own category, type, or species, which is defined by being created in the image and likeness of, and here's again where I would put the word Elohim and not capital G God. Are you okay with that, Mike, that I keep doing that?
Yeah.
I wish we had always kept this in the plural. That makes sense? And I know that we talk about the image of God as a title and as an idea, and we always make it singular. And I'm confused by that because the text makes it plural purposely, right?
Well, I think some of that also has to do that, we get the declaration, the conversation, right, that God is having with his divine assembly or council, however we want to describe the whole entire entourage. Mm-hmm. But when we get to verse 27, right, where the author is then mentioning the actual creation act itself, the verb, from what I understand, so Elohim created man in his own image. The created, the verb there is, it actually moves back into third person singular, masculine.
Yeah, singular. So I understand why we put a capital G on that. Yeah.
And so I think there's that acknowledgement. The ESV is doing the very clever thing of, we're not going to capitalize the our or the us, right? So you can make your interpretive decision. But then when we get to verse 27, a lot of folks sort of take the context of verse 27, the singular masculine there, and then they apply that right back up into verse 26. And so I think it's more important to actually let the flow of the text go and acknowledge God seems to be having a conversation with a group. It's not just with himself, or even in the concept of Trinitarian thought, just the Father speaking with the Son and the Son speaking with the Spirit, but that this was an actual conversation with a large host of other beings.
Right. Good, thank you. And let me finish this slide and we'll get back to the text. However, at some level, humans belong to the divine class. This is interesting how she says it. At some level, humans belong to the divine class or species. I like that. That is, humanity's kind or type is, and here's where I'd put the word Elohim, generally, divine. Our kind or type is divine, if indeed Genesis 1 conceives of humanity as God's royal son. And here's where she goes into another topic, which I won't discuss here, is the idea of royalty. And by the way, this is common, and I know you've done some study on this, that in 126 and 7 nowadays, the discussion whether it be an N.T. Wright, in fact, I have his book, Simply Christian, in front of me, page 36. The ancient biblical creation story offers a powerful and pregnant picture for all this. Humans, it says, are made in God's image. In the ancient world, this is again N.T. Wright, Simply Christian, the name of the book, Why Christianity Makes Sense. In the ancient world, page 36, in the ancient world, as indeed in some parts of the modern one, great rulers would often set up statues, icons, images of themselves in prominent places, not so much in their own home territory, but in the foreign or far-flung dominions. The subjects of that country would be reminded that you were their ruler. That's why you'd put an image out either in the along a highway saying, this belongs to me, this area, or, and this is common today, the idea of a temple, the idea that you would make a temple as a worshiper of a deity, that's their home, then you would install an image in the most holy room in that home. Now you sense where that Holy of Holies idea is in the Ark of the Covenant in biblical tradition. And so that has often been caught today, that the image, well, I'd say it's pretty modern. We haven't, old commentators didn't catch up on this as much as today, but the idea that this story would have caught the original reader as God, as it were, the image of, or the illustration of God creating a home in which he was going to live, and then putting an image of himself in that home, and that would fit this idea of mankind being in the image. The one distinction I would make is that, again, remember, we are made in the image of plural Elohim too, and as long as we keep that plurality there, personally, I'm happy. I realize I can't win that debate, that debate in every conversation, but I am made divine. Or how did Catherine say it? We are made in a type or class that is divine. That's fascinating to me, right? And we talked about this last time, how the implications of that are stunning, and especially as I've often said in talking to my atheist friend, I've had debates with him in public settings, and I've said to the audience numerous times that the closest worldview I have to my Christian worldview, the one that I battle the most in my mind, thinking if Christianity isn't true, then you know what's closest to me is atheism. Just the idea that this is all we have. You know, the physical world is it, right? To me, that's the other option. Excuse me. That's the other option that's always hanging out there for me. And this verse is basically shooting that one. It's saying, Ron, you've got, well, here's how I hear the verse talking to me. Ron, when God made you, you've got to get this in your head. He made you more like a god than a dog. You cannot approach your world in a purely physical way and think you're going to get away with it. It won't be satisfying to you. It won't make sense to you. You're going to think it will. Again, I think Jesus comes on the scene. This is what understatement of the day, but this is what I love about Jesus so many times. He will, pick up where people are, and he'll notice that materialism has become a real thing, right? And, watch out for money. And where did that come from in their world? Well, he wasn't talking to rich people all the time, but the idea that it's so easy to interpret what's in front of you from a purely physical standpoint. And this verse is the one, talk about right off the bat. God says you can't do that. Yeah. Let us make man in a divine way after our similarity. So that's why when I go outside, I'm always amazed. My skin can only handle about a 10-degree window of comfort. What is it? Maybe 75 to 65, somewhere in there. I've got to always live within that. We're the only species that wears clothes. Why? I think God made us in an image that's inhospitable to the world in a lot of ways. And so anyway, we can leave it there, but anything else we want to add about the image of God? Should we feel free to put it behind us?
I personally have always loved just discussing these verses, and last Sunday I actually got to preach at my church because we're currently doing a series that's like a foundation series on where do we draw our authority from. And so I actually went into the Genesis 1-3 passage, mostly Genesis 3, but I had to go back to Genesis 1 a little bit and Genesis 2 to kind of give the context. And one of the things I mentioned, and this was actually part of my studies that I did with Dr. McDowell, she had us look up ancient Egyptian priestly rituals and rites that they would do. And one of the little bits and pieces that I discovered in that research was that the Egyptians and a lot of other cultures in that day, they had the concept that only one person was actually created in the image of the head god of whatever the pantheon
was.
Right,
that'd be the sun, right? That would be the ruler.
Yeah.
That would come behind him.
Yeah, and so for the Egyptians, it would be Pharaoh. Pharaoh would be the very image of God. It would always, typically that image of God kind of vernacular would be given only to one very special person who is ruling essentially the nation. And what's mind-blowing is that in these verses, this is basically applied to all of humanity. And not just male, but also female. And that both of them make the image of God. And so that was a point that I highlighted within, for my congregation, simply that this is really just a mind-blowing concept, and how it's really is this foundation of a lot of our modern views of, human dignity and human worth, but we don't even realize it comes from these verses And it was written and penned by people who are living at that time when this was actually finally written down. They were under the yoke of brutal and terrible empires. And yet here they're claiming this truth that every human being is made in the image of God and also other gods.
Yeah. It'll be fun when we get to, and by the way, I'm going to say heaven every now and then, and I don't mean the traditional the view as much as the new creation, right? And I'm all about that somehow we're going to be entering a new world that is going to be very physical in some sense. So I'm all about that. But when we say going to heaven, you know what I mean, right?
Yep.
That when we get there, it's going to be stunning, as we've said, to notice how Gabriel and Michael, this happens, by the way, in Revelation, when twice, I think, doesn't John bow down to a divine being, and the divine being says, "Get up, you're a fellow servant now." And so that only happens in Revelation. Mm-hmm. Nowhere else before that moment in the biblical story, when a human bows to a divine being, does the divine being say, "Hey, get up"? No, they always say, "Stay down." and I find that interesting, that we, and we'll see this again as we study the rest of the Bible as we go, that our role as humanoids is to worship or prostrate, the same word in Hebrew and Greek, prostrate ourselves in front of a divine being if we met them. That would be our role, right? At the same time, we will someday get to the other side, and they will pull us up and say, "Welcome to a new world in which we are now equals." That's where I sense we're going with this. Yes, thanks. 127, male and female. I think that's said kind of in a by the way, just in case your current culture, wherever, whoever read this the first time, wherever you are, just understand that whether you're male or female, you are equally part of this divine image. Beautiful idea. Mm-hmm. And Mike, I don't know your view on this, so let me give you mine, and you're welcome to push back if you'd like, because a lot of these things we talk about on the podcast, we don't pre-discuss them. So I don't know where you're going to land on this, but in 8:22, this is Genesis 8:22, after they get off the ark. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night, this shall not cease. In other words, God has set up, and I think this 8:22, in other words, refers back to the created order of, the rhythms of seed time, harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer. Notice that in that rhythm, you have natural life and death motion, right? Back and forth. Leaves fall off trees and die. So the idea of death, here's my idea that I'm throwing at you. And I don't know where Mike was. Maybe, again, Mike's views better than I do on a lot of things. And the idea of plant death before Genesis 3, I think would be a given, right? That we have a carbon-based system that God has set up in Genesis 1 that he calls very good, right? And there has been no, quote, fall yet. Adam and Eve have not disobeyed in Genesis 3. But what we have coming out of Genesis 1, where we are, is a rhythm of nature cycles that would include plant death at least. And my recommendation would be also animal death. That carnivores are simply doing their thing when they eat another animal, and that God made it that way, that this is how he designed it. And that when we look at an animal eating another animal, it's not sinful. It's not a result of the fall. This is my opinion. Okay, I'm just giving you my opinion. I know that the church fathers were all over this discussion in both sides, but the idea that death itself started with Adam's fall, to me, is hard to imagine in a world where thus carnivores can't eat other animals. To me, it's all part of the system, and that's why 8:22, when it says winter and summer, day and night, that this carbon-based world that we were originally given, here's my point, had cycles of death built in, and animal and plant death, therefore, are not a point to be discussed in the fall, but they were simply built into the creation. What do you think of that?
So this is just my initial hot take, right? Because like we said, you didn't tell me you were going to throw this at me, but
welcome to the Divine Council Worldview Podcast. Yeah,
love to be here. But the initial thought I had, and honestly, this is actually something that I thought about a long time ago, because I think the question wasn't about that verse. My thought years ago was, So if nothing died, if there was no such thing as decay before the fall of Adam and Eve, then what was the purpose of the insects?
Yeah, how do you...
like everything that I know about the insect world, and it's not a lot. I don't study creepy crawly things, but the most basic stuff I remember from my science classes are these time lapses of, like maybe like a sardine left out in the open, and all these ants come and then basically consume the flesh and like basically pick it bone clean, literally bone clean, and the rest of whatever's not eaten away will just dissolve and break down into the ground and turn back into soil. And so, like in my mind, it's like if God had created insects, and that is like one of their primary purposes is to essentially be the garbage eaters of the world. And
that's a good point. Yeah.
And to thankfully just break things down and return it to the ground.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's a great thing.
Right. Yeah. So you're saying, and I think thus we agree, that the idea of a carbon-based system can be pronounced in 131 as very good, but it can include the idea of rhythms, thus the dying and rebirthing, right, after its kind, that this whole rebirthing issue is part of that. It's very good. This is what God created, a system whereby carbon-based life forms are going to die and come back, or I'm sorry, reproduce, right? So, okay, well, again, notice that in that kind of a discussion, we don't, as a podcast, have to mandate anything there. It's just that, and that's where the Divine Council Worldview to me is so fascinating. There are many dividing points or trails that the dominoes, once you tip out, you separate into 2 or 3 options on a verse. It's fun to think through how those dominoes tip and where will that affect the rest of your theology or the story going forward. Mm-hmm. I would say that you could have a world of death at this point, even human death, and I'll get to that in a second, that's not offending the later story from what I understand. But let's move forward from there. Let's, in fact, go back to the text and close out chapter 1 again. God said, bless them. Now, here's my challenge. Again, this is, and actually, let me bring up a book that Mike originally, before he passed, he did interview Swamidass. Do I have his? There it is. I got the book right over here. This is S. Joshua Swamidass. The Genealogical Adam and Eve is the title of the book, subtitle, The Surprising Science of Universal Ancestry. I was able to attend the session at ETS that he talked at, and delightful speaker. And I have not had a chance to read the whole book, but his basic theory in the book, and it was very well received, it's been very well reviewed, is the idea that, and watch this in 120, let's go back to it, I'm sorry, going the wrong way here. If you were reading this the first time, okay, or listening to it at your father's knee, and you heard this verse, let us make mankind in a divine or our image after our likeness, God says. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Notice the everything, right? So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of Elohim, he created him. There's, I think, that second, that parallel idea that might open it up to the plural beings again. In the image of Elohim, he created him. Male and female, he created them, and God blessed them. I'm in 128 now. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Now, we already had that said about the animals earlier, or birds, I believe. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you, mankind, every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, every tree, and to every beast and every bird, and to every, I'm moving through 130 now, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. 131, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening in the morning, the 6th day. And of course, on the 7th day, he rests. And now we're into chapter 2, which is where we were going originally. Wouldn't you, and this, again, let me throw this at you, Mike, that as an idea, that if I'm reading that the first time or hearing it, my guess would be I have in the picture of my mind a world that's being peopled or populated by first birds and then animals and beasts of all kinds and fish and everything. And then God says, let's make humans, but let's make them divine in some way. Make them like the divine world. I'm still going to put them on the earth. They're going to have hands and rib cages and all the things that vertebrates have. But I'm going to make them more divine than they know, shall we even say. And they'll figure that out as they go. And then as you end up chapter 1, wouldn't the reader think that the writer has told them or given them the impression that the entire world now is filled with these humans?
I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Because this also goes back into some of the textual criticisms and some people thinking that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are two completely separated different stories of creation. And so I think there's, depending on where does one land there or how chapter 1 and chapter 2 connect, if there is a connection, do they reconcile with one another? I think like what Swamidass did was that he took the leeway that is in between chapters 1 and 2, the textual ambiguity in a sense, right? Because the word is just them. It's just simply the plural pronoun. So it doesn't give us a number. So we have no idea.
More than 2.
Yeah,
in other words,
it's or at least 2, right? Because you got at least the male and female, but then the question is, were there more? And
right.
And so like the text is ambiguous at best. Yeah. But I do agree because we get into this pattern and we're thinking, they're going to fill the earth. But at the same time, you also do have verse 28 where God is giving them the command, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, as though you guys haven't done that yet. But that's the command. You need to obey that because that'd be a good thing for the human race.
Right. Yeah. So let me do this in our remainder of this podcast is go into chapter 2 thinking, just test driving this. And by the way, this is what Swamidass does in the book. For those of you who haven't or need to read it. What he says is, and he does it in very clear language for the non-scientist, he says, all I'm saying is that when you look at the genealogical record of mankind, not the genetic, but the genealogical record of mankind, it scientifically works that you could have a large population of humans and then have 2 specially created humans that give rise to, how does he put this specifically? In AD, 2 specifically created humans that are not that old. 4,000 BC would be fine for him. In other words, and this is where my science, I'm no good at it, but the idea that he's simply trying to say, if I read Genesis 1 and I have a whole bunch of people that are populating the world, and then I have in chapter 2, 2 more people who are specially created or formed and put into this hobby farm, would that work in the genealogical record of the human race? And he says, yes, it actually works. Now that's where I'll leave you with the book. And again, I have not had time I just don't have the time personally to get into all that, but that's what he recommends. So let's do this in chapter 2, and let's just kind of read the text to see how this would work if we were to presume that we end chapter 1 with a world full of humans, okay? You get into 2:1, God, of course, in the first 3 verses simply takes a rest on the 7th day, which is simply illustrative for what he's going to recommend humans do as well. Verse 4, these are the toledot, the generations of the heavens. This is the story of the earth. And this word toledot is used, 10 times in the story of where the writer kind of stops and says, there it is, toledot. This is where, let me give you the story of something or someone or a family line. And here's the story of the heavens and the earth in the day that the Lord God, this is, by the way, the first mention of Yahweh in the Bible. 2:4.
Yep.
In the day that the Yahweh Elohim, notice how putting them together is a expected way of describing which Elohim we're talking about. In that day, the Yahweh Elohim, the specific Elohim named Yahweh, made the heavens and the earth. This is again a shot at any of the worldviews of that ancient time that believed that the world was the product of a divine battle, right, or multiple deities that were doing this. No, this is the day that one Elohim made everything. So he runs the place, and we're given that very clearly here in 2:4. Then you have this 2:5 idea. It's kind of going back to the original story of when no bush of the field was yet in the land. I'm not sure how to read that. I'm willing, for the sake of time, to skip over it because I want to get to 2:7.
Okay.
Then, and the reason I highlight it here, 2:7. Then notice that in Hebrew, if you can get over to the right side of the page, the word then is a bit interpretive because it's just another vav,
Yep.
which in Hebrew can be and most commonly. In fact, most of the verses that have preceded 2:7 start with and or a vav, and you can, if you're watching this, you can see at the beginning of verses that little Hebrew letter vav, which is again a consecutive usually. It just means the next thing in line in the telling of the story. So the ESV uses then in 2:7, and you could have done like in the New King James in the middle here, and. Right. So here's the point. There is no time marker in 2:7. We're not given any sense of, let's go back and retell the story. That certainly is not said, not even implied. And if anything, here's the reason I think it's helpful. If anything, the text to the first time reader would give the impression that we're still in a consecutive storytelling fashion. Then, or next in line, here's what happens next. So let's read it. Then the Lord God formed. Formed is often in Hebrew yatzar. It can mean create, or can, in other words, I don't think it has to be a non-creative act. God could have created this being that we're going to talk about, but the choice of the word now is formed in Hebrew. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust. Notice the man of dust. In ESV, we have an article, the man.
Yeah.
In the New King James, it just says formed man. Well, in Hebrew, we do have, there is the word, it does have the hey in front of it. So there is an article. Yeah. In other words, point is, I like the ESV rendering because I think it's more fair to the text that it says the man of dust from the ground.
Adam.
And again, why am I bringing this up?
Yeah, like ha Adam apar.
I'm sorry. Yep. The man of dust. So what's the difference? Well, if you say, and the Lord God formed man in the New King James, you may think, well, okay, I guess we're talking about the people we talked about in 126. Mm-hmm. But if you go with the ESV, then the Lord God formed the man of dust. That's unique. He has not done that yet in the story that I've been told until now. So that's how I'm going to read it. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, the ruach of life. Wait, or no, that's well, the idea of I'm trying to think of the Hebrew idea behind breath. It's not ruach, but nefesh. Okay, that's what I was thinking. But let's get on or move on. The man and the man. And notice again, King James just says, and man became a living being. Almost, that's where I think the New King James is giving me the impression that this is a retelling of Genesis 1. Sure. Whereas the ESV, and the man, the one we're talking about now, became a living creature. My point is that I could read 2:7 as a new story. It wouldn't hurt the story to me. I think it flows nicely. What does he do with this man, this being? The Lord God planted a garden in Eden. We don't know where that is. In the east. So there seems to be a place called Eden. And then in the east of that side of that land, he puts a garden. Okay. And there he put the man whom he had formed. Notice again how specific that is. 2:9. And out of the ground the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight. And so this seems to be a local story.
Yep.
Out of the ground there, spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life. Now this is interesting. Again, for sake of time, don't have a lot of time for that. You can look this up in a Bible dictionary and get tons of information on the tree of life. It's a common element of the ancient world that trees, think of Psalm 1, that a prosperous person will grow like a tree planted by the rivers of water. In other words, the idea of trees in the ancient world often had the sense of surplus and life and abundance and reproduction, stuff like that. So God does, in this story, and I think it's a very physical story, it's real. He puts a tree, calls it the tree of life, was in the midst of or in the middle of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as well. So again, there's two trees. One's called the tree of life. One's called the knowledge of good and evil. Let's hang on for that for our next episode, because it comes up in 2:17 again when we have the story. A river flows, and 2:11. Or 2:10, 11, and 12 talk about the rivers, and one's called Pishon, one's called, we don't know where that is, one's called the Gihon. Well, we know that where there's a little Gihon River, or Gihon Valley, but we generally don't know where these two rivers are. The third and fourth rivers, the Tigris in verse 14,
and the Euphrates, those are actually able to be, defined. And so on a map like this, the Tigris and Euphrates run in the Levant over there in modern day Iraq. And in this world of the writer, this would have been Babylon. Moses would have been speaking in a world that knew that Tigris and Euphrates were rivers that traversed the land of Sumer and Assyria and Babylon. So far away from Israel, of course. But the point is that when commentators talk about where these four rivers meet, as though and that's what the text does, that this is where this Eden is, we're not quite sure. And I don't think, again, it matters to our conversation here as to where Eden is. I personally think it's, as you even see here, the word Assyria. By the way, that's a good example of reminding the reader we're talking about a time period that is pre-Assyria, but we're using the word Assyria for the reader to know where this is, right? So Moses is talking in his time period. And let's leave it there for our podcast for this time. Let's come back to this, because what we've basically done is set up 2:15, where God takes the man, puts him in the garden, and tells him what to do. So anything else that Mike, that's on your head or on your mind before we end 2:14? We basically set up a world in which, here's what I'm recommending, we have a populated earth with plants, animals, beasts, and humans. Then God says, let me tell a story. Here's what I'm going to do. Now, again, we don't know the story until we know the story, so I'm not going to put anything into the mind of, like the text doesn't. I'm not going to talk about the story until I see elements, come out of it. But all we know so far is that God says to himself, what I'm going to do, or what we find out that he does, is create a hairless biped, a man of dust, forms him, puts him in a garden, and that garden is somewhere near Assyria. So that's all we know so far. Fair enough.
Fair enough?
Yeah.
All righty. Well, let's wrap this one up then. And thanks everyone again for putting up with us. The text is a beautiful thing. And our thoughts and prayers again to Drina. And as we're coming upon the first anniversary of Mike's death, we're only here because of what Mike did. We can't replace him. And I lost, I know for you, Mike, much can be said, and let me say my piece again. I lost my greatest theological conversation partner, and when I lost Mike, and I'm continuing this with him in mind, and again with many people who have been influenced by his work over the years. And so glad to be a part of this, and we'll welcome you back next time. Thanks.
Bye, folks.